into it. For those who are maybe unfamiliar, and I know there aren't probably that many who are completely unfamiliar with, we always like to recap Motor Cities National Heritage Area and who we are and sort of what we do to set the stage. So we are an affiliate of the National Park Service. The funding that we are distributing via our grant program is actually funding provided from the National Park Service grant as a match. So we have to treat it as such. It is federal funding, but we are an affiliate of the National Park Service, founded by a collaboration of organizations and involved citizens who are interested in supporting their automotive and labor heritage here in the region. What is a heritage area? It is a place designated by Congress that tells an American story through their unique natural, cultural, and historical resources. So we are not a physical park as much as we are, in our case, a cultural landscape. But there are 49 heritage areas across the country that deal with different subject matters that may pertain to their region's particular influence on U.S. History. So ours is automotive and labor history. There is an aviation national heritage area in Dayton, Ohio, that obviously talks about that subject. In Springfield, Illinois, there's the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area, which links together all of the sites related to Abraham Lincoln's story through Springfield. These are the concentrations of that story. So our story is automotive and labor history. Our mission is to preserve, interpret, and promote the region's rich automotive and labor heritage and the related economic development and impacts of that. And at the bottom of this screen, you see our founding partners, Ford, at that time it was Daimler Chrysler, but now FCA, GM, UAW, and the National Park Service. But really, ultimately, we are a community of automotive and labor heritage partners. We are stewards or keepers of our story and preserving our history. So all of us, whether we are a small historical society, an individual who's been the orator, the keeper of the story for their community, or a large institution, we are all stewards in preserving our local history. We are the combined amplified voices of our region. And in most cases, that is the biggest value to being a part of the heritage area, is that we are taking those individual stories, those silos that exist in individual communities, and linking them all together to tell a cohesive story for those who visit our region and can understand more about our history. But ultimately, we are our community and our projects. You are on the phone with 1/4 of the full-time staff of Motor Cities National Heritage Area. And though we cover 10,000 square miles, we are not a huge staff. But what we are is we are a connection of all of your work projects and partners. So we're happy to see all of you here today. We're interested about looking into our grant program to further those projects and those efforts in your communities. Just a few examples that really exemplify Motor Cities. We are the Ford Village Industry Plant. So this is one of the real foundational projects and mantras of Motor Cities, which is Henry Ford's Village Industry Plants along the Rouge River and the other waterways in sort of the Wayne County area. These were Henry Ford's first small factories that fed into his larger factories, where he employed sort of from a farm to factory mentality, using his agrarian farming roots. He made great use of the water and its natural power to produce electricity. And of course, these plants were productive in their parts to supply up to a larger plant. So we interpret that story. These plants are also exemplary of the preservation efforts of Motor Cities, in that when we started, even as we were starting, of the 30 some plants that were around the area, they were slated for demolition, condemnation, and I believe all but 3 of those plants were saved and have been utilized in some sort of adaptive reuse, whether they're community centers, or in this case, the image you see is the Nankin Mills, which is the nature center and park offices for Wayne County Parks. We are the Fort Piquette Avenue plant. This is, again, exemplary of our preservation efforts of a physical space that was Henry Ford's first factory that he built and operated from 1904 to 1910. It has stood all this time thanks to great architecture and parts, materials, but it tells a unique story of where that company started, not only the company, but the ideology for a life-changing automobile called the Model T that came out of this plant. So you see the picture on your bottom left, which is where the plant was founded, where they founded when they were looking to restore it, I believe, around 2000. And where it stands now, your upper right, as a National Historic Landmark, as a global tourist destination, attracting thousands of visitors each year, giving fantastic tours in a space that is authentic to the heritage area that you can only get here in the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. We supported that through a variety of different efforts, but one is through management of a HUD grant to do some major work on fire suppression. We've worked on the roof, we've worked on the facade. So these are all ideas that were in the incubator and moved along throughout our relationship with this Fort Piquette Avenue plant. On the labor side of things, this is a project that is sort of in the planning stages right now. We're looking to implement, which is the Fort Street Bridge Park. The story tells that of the 1932 Fort Hunger March, which took place, sort of launched at the point of a bridge, the Fort Street Bridge, was crossed between Detroit into Dearborn, close to Henry Ford's Rouge plant. So this was one of those labor moments pre-UAW, but certainly represented the need for better relationship between workers, uh, uh, organizations, companies, and their communities. Five people died at this march in March of 1932, and the commemorative marker that was there, unfortunately, when MDOT replaced the bridge a few years ago, had to come down. So we were challenged as a community group to come up with a way that we could still tell the story of that park space without being at the original location, and now we're building a new park on MDOT property to tell that story. Last year, our Building the Engine programming really celebrated or commemorated. I mentioned the 1932 Fort Hunger March, but you see the list here of other major labor history anniversaries that occurred last year. They obviously occur every year, but last year was either their 80th or 85th anniversary, and we chose to commemorate them with a series of programming activity in the local communities in Flint, in Lansing, in Detroit, and Dearborn, but also on our website, also through blogs and stories of the week and other special programming. We are our story of the week, and this is something that is our most popular outreach tool each week as part of our uh, You Ought to Know newsletter. There is a historic story that comes out that tells of a time going by, of an automobile, of a designer, and in this case, our story of the week is out every week, but it is our most popular and engaging tool um, as we go along trying to tell this heritage story. As part of the National Park Service, we are able to participate in the National Parks Passport Stamp Program. About 22 organizations across our region are able to receive those stamps, and those stamps are in the same stratosphere as the same stamp that you would get if you were at the Yellowstone Park or the Grand Canyon. So they are part of the National Park Service lure, and they are at our local museums and partners. We are our auto heritage events. Certainly, we support events that celebrate that the heritage and bring people to our communities. Once they're here, they're able to enjoy even more, learn even more about what is makes a place like Flint, a place like Lansing or Ypsilanti, Kalamazoo so special and so integral to our automotive story. So we are those who celebrate our events as attractions that bring people to our region, that create economic activity, and of course draw people to our attractions to learn more. We are our Wayside Exhibit program. Again, speaking of those who visit our region and those who live in our regions. If you're around our communities, we've installed around 260 of these interpretive markers, like the one you see here, that tells the story of a person, place, ideas that created the communities and the neighborhoods that shaped the auto industry. And they were positioned in a way in local city centers and libraries and city halls and along parkways and trails so that as people happen upon them, they're learning something about their auto history. As I'm going along, please, again, if you have any questions, anything that you need to post there, please feel free. If you're having any issues, let me know as I go along because I'm hearing me, but I'm not going to hear you guys until you chime in there. So just want to remind you of that. We are our Motor Cities Heritage signs coming very soon. We've been working with the Michigan Department of Transportation to install signs that indicate that you are either entering or in the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. And this is all to further impress upon our residents and our visitors that they're in a space of national significance. The place has been set aside for its automotive and labor heritage story. You'll be seeing these soon in the feeder thoroughfares across the state. So if you're coming in from I-94 from the west or coming from the north through Saginaw and Flint down I-75, or you're coming up from US 23, all of these, you will start to see these markers pop up that indicate you're entering the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. And even if you are traveling between, say, Flint and Lansing or Lansing and Detroit, you'll see these along some of those connectors like I-96. So just to let you know, you're in the heritage area. It may have been a while, but you are still in the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. We cover 10,000 square miles of the state, and we have to let people know that each one of those are claimed for this automotive history. Just to share with you a recent economic impact study by a company called Trip Ombach that shows that all of the activities, the things that I described, the things that you all are already doing in your communities and the programming that we support, generates about $410 million in economic impact each year. That supports more than 4,500 jobs and generates $35 million in tax revenue. That's certainly nothing to sneeze at, and for all that we put into it, it's a pretty good return on that. So ultimately, we are accountable in the sense that for every $1 of taxpayer investment, there's $8 leveraged in our community. So it really means a lot to the programs that we support, that they are able to take the funds that they're able to take the funds that we modest funds that we invest and utilize them to leverage even more in their community. So we are ultimately accountable to our funders in that case, and again, particularly with our grant program, which comes from the National Park Service. I'll pause again here. We're really going to get into now our grant program, but I'll pause again just to remind everyone if you'd like to chime in either on the chat. I see some people also leaving some questions in the question area, so I can see those as well. But let me know if you've got anything as we go along. But we're now getting into sort of the nitty gritty of our grant program and what we're here for today. So our Motor Cities Challenge Grant Program matches 20% of eligible expenses and reimburses funds to recipient organizations. So we always want to make that clear right up front that the program is reimbursement based, meaning that it is based on expenditures that are made during the grant period, and then you submit a request to us and we reimburse you. And I'll go through all the details of how that works, but I always want to make that clear up front, the funding source, the match amount, and the fact that it is a reimbursement based fund. Grant funds are based on the federal calendar that we had to adhere to. So our federal calendar starts October 1st and ends September 30th. So for a grant for a particular year, activities have to fall between that window of time. If you are approved for a grant that straddles, say, into a second year, then we essentially submit all eligible expenses for 1 year, and then the day after that, on September 1st of the next year, we start a new book and we continue moving forward. So even if your grant is approved over multiple years, you have to sort of wrap up 1 year, fiscal year wise, and then we start a new year October 1st and continue on. Just to give you some background on that, the funding began almost immediately after the Motor Cities Heritage Area was founded in 1998. After some planning and organizational period in 2002, we started to award grant funds and have awarded grants every year since then. So there's always been some sort of grant programming here with Motor Cities. And over its 19 years, Motor Cities has awarded, actually, the update, it's about $1.45 million in grants over 240 projects and programs. And you all have leveraged more than $5 million in that additional support. So the grants really work in leveraging and getting new funders and supporters to the table. So that's why we continue, certainly, as a way to empower our partners and produce great projects. The grant process is primarily online. I would say primarily in that I certainly encourage you to reach out to me as the grant coordinator to ask questions about your proposal while you're forming it and before you submit it. But the entire process of formal submission occurs online at motorcities.org/grants. You're able to log into the online system, and again, we'll talk about it as we go along. Where you're able to keep up with your progress as you move through, and it is all online. So there are no paper forms to be filled out and mailed in. There's no reason to send sort of that supplementary support documentation. It all happens online, even the opportunity to upload additional information. At the end of the process, participants are required to report on certain impacts and statistics. So keep it in mind as you go through it that you should be keeping up with what you are doing, and be prepared to report on things like visitorship or usage at the end of the project. Again, as you structure your proposal, you'll think about that, and most times people build that in right in. And then financial reports and requests are requested to be submitted on a monthly basis. For those who are selected to be grant recipients, you can submit often. That's the idea, is you want to keep a steady flow of the reimbursement coming back to you for those who are selected, so that you keep new funds into your account. So we are open for that. The dollars that we are granted to you have already been funded in our budget, so there is no additional issue with that. We just ask that you submit your request timely. That way, it's not too backlogged, and you don't have to wait even longer about for your reimbursement. Just to give you a snapshot of last year's grant program, there were 11 grant partners awards. The average was about 9,800. The highest award, 25,000. And though technically there is no upper limit to our awards, funds are divided equally among approved applicants. So we obviously don't want any one project to receive too much of the pie based on what we're able to dole out, but we want to be fair and equitable, and we understand that some projects scale-wise um, merit a different award than others. So all projects are considered and judged equally, and that is sort of the statistics from last year. Just some more examples to get people's ideas going, and certainly ideas you may have on your projects, because it's not just we get a lot of submissions for, say, exhibit work, and that's great if you're installing a new exhibit at your museum, and we're able to support that. But think about some of the outside of the box stuff, like the preservation of intellectual property. So this was a grant that was submitted by the Detroit Historical Society for the digitization of their collection. So making that collection of two-dimensional objects available to obviously a larger audience by being able to digitize it and post it online with proper keyword and indexing, so that now people can find information in their catalog. They can just search through and find information about whatever research topic they have. So that's an important asset to allow our world-class collections to be accessible across the region. On a preservation level, there was no exhibit here, but this is the Hamtramck Historical Museum, who actually installed a climate control system. This was critical for anyone who's in the curatorial world and understands the need for climate control when you have precious artifacts that are being maintained. Well, they needed that, and we were happy to be a part of that process and making sure that their building was safe for the artifacts that they are maintaining. And it takes a little burden off of them in order to allow them to be better stewards of those pieces and move forward there. So very proud to have been part of that project. But then you have probably even bigger, more hardcore, large scale work was the restoration of the Henry Ford estate, Henry Ford's home in Dearborn. This is an ongoing project that we can participate in different levels. We're certainly not the main funder that's going to provide the some $20 million that it takes to pull that project off, but we are able to provide a little plasterwork here, a little furniture restoration here, some interpretive signage there. So think about the pieces of your project that could amount to and have great impact, especially in such a progressive sort of way that you are working towards an inline, but there are little steps along the way that you have to accomplish. Just to give you an example of the way we recognize those projects, we're happy to be involved in them. And this is a shot of how we recognize. Our awards of excellence are done each year annually at the state capitol. We do it in November in conjunction with Michigan Auto Heritage Day, and this is where we get the chance to recognize outstanding projects in preservation, education, and auto heritage tourism. In this photo that you're seeing to your far left is Sean Lecker Palmaville Size, who is our executive director. Next to her is Marge Sarek, who received the Heritage Tourism Award for her work with the Friends of the Highland Recreation Area and a place called Haven Hill. This was the second home of auto magnate Edsel Ford out in the White Lake area. So obviously several miles away from his Grosse Pointe home, for those who are familiar with that geography. But this is his second home. It was pretty popular at that time for these auto leaders to have a second location. And they've been doing extensive interpretive work to get the space open, but ultimately it's a tourism attraction for people to come and take a look at what was lost and what still remains of that space. In the middle is Anne-Marie Graham Hudak, who is from the Detroit Blues Historical Society. So their project, a very unique one when you talk about automotive impact, is that they did a documentary on a musician, a gentleman named Uncle Jesse White, who like many folks, traveled in that sort of great migration period, traveled north to be a factory worker here, I believe worked for Ford. And with him came a lot of his Mississippi influence. He brought his music and his cooking. And as most people did, they had to share that culture with their line brothers and sisters. And so music became the universal language that bonded them together across their differences. And he became renowned locally as a great jazz musician and purveyor of music. So they created a documentary that really told that story about how impactful that auto culture was on bringing things like music and other cultural blends together. And then to your far right is Ray Knight, who is the president of the board of the Yankee Air Museum. And for those who followed that story, they have reclaimed the Willow Run Bomber plant in the Ypsilanti area, actually in Belleville, and it is going to become the future home of the Yankee Air Museum as now an extension or an affiliate of the Smithsonian Museum. So great things that are happening there. So they would, of course, been receiving our preservation award. Just to give you an idea of how great projects are recognized, or sort of at the end once they're all been wrapped up. So now we get into some questions about eligibility for those who are on the line and looking to apply to our grant program. The question is, are you eligible? So first question is, are you a recognized nonprofit organization, government entity, or educational institution in the heritage areas? And your address, your operating address and corporation is inside the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. And if so, then yes, you are eligible. Next is, do you have a project which is designed to highlight the rich auto and labor heritage of our region? So again, we look for projects that are based on that. Just being an organization within the heritage area is not enough. It is whether you have a project that is designed to highlight the auto heritage of the region. So if so, then you can check that one out. Do you have a timeline that fits into completion by September 30th? So again, I explained the year-end sort of federal calendar that we work on. So even as we are soliciting grants right now, we're looking for projects that are or could be completed by September 30th of this year. So sort of immediate impact projects or projects that can be phased in a way that they complete it that way. So there's that. So you can check that one off. And are you a member of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area? So again, grants are eligible to those who are members. So these are organizational memberships, and it's a small price to pay for the opportunity to sort of be involved in grants. It also shows that you are vested in the heritage area. So the belief is that if you have checked all of these boxes, that you are indeed eligible to continue on and look at our grant application. So hooray, you are eligible. Just to give you this reference point again and to set some dates, the online application is available at motorcities.org/grants. I've included that link in the chat area if you want to take a look at it there. You could also take a look at it when we're done with the presentation, but motorcities.org/grants has the link to the official application as well as some reference materials. This current grant cycle that we're discussing here has a due date of Wednesday, February 28th. So we are just about a month away or just a few weeks away from that official due date. By 11:59 Eastern Standard Time on that date, we want to have all applications in so that we can get the timely review of those. And now really the moment that you've been waiting for, which is to take a look at the forms. So we really want to step through now the process of how these forms are completed and what you can expect to see. These slides that you're going to see are the actual elements of the form as you go through the online form. So this is direct reference to what you will see as you begin to fill out the form online. There's also a PDF version of the application online for those who like to do it that way. So I encourage people to sort of do the preparation work as you are going through, so that way when you go to the online form, you simply drop it in all the required elements, and there's no sweat or no concern about that. And we'll talk about that preparation piece in a moment as well. So this is the first thing that you see once you launch the application information. You'll be identifying your project name. So what are you calling your project? You're calling it the Climate Control Project, then that should be it. You should have a clear project start date and end date. Obviously, important to the element I described about looking at when your project is going to finish in relationship to fiscal year, so that we can budget appropriately for when grants are going to be paid out. Does your project involve a National Historic Landmark? Again, we are an affiliate of the National Park Service, and one of the requirements they have is for us to note anytime we are working with a National Historic Landmark, and especially if it involves some sort of preservation or restoration work on that facility, then we should be up to date. A federal tax ID, of course, again, I mentioned that you need to be a nonprofit organization, an educational institution, so you should have your federal tax ID for reference here. Being a Motor Cities member is also necessary, and you want to identify what mission area you are serving. There are three Motor Cities mission areas: education, which includes interpretation; preservation, which is the second; and then heritage tourism is the third. So you want to think about where your project best fits when you're deciding. Sometimes people are looking at a project that might fit multiple categories, but you really want to think about the best fit for it, characterizing your project. And then the next area in that same section is a common question that we receive, which is what stewardship area I'm in. So we use this to sort of get an idea of where our applications are coming from, just to kind of get good geographical distribution. So you want to take a look at that. And the first one that pops up is Detroit River, but I'll show you a list here of all of the stewardship communities across the region. So when we were created, in order to sort of come up with a management of how we were going to work with our footprint, we had to break down and divide the area into stewardship communities, and this allowed us to sort of have local touch points and contacts within those areas to keep up to date on what's going on, and generally to kind of hook up like-minded groups and organizations. So if you are in the downriver area, we may be aware of another group that is also in the downriver area, in which case we can connect you there. So just to give you a better idea, here is a visual map of the area. You see this 10,000 square miles of southeast Michigan. Our furthest west point is Kalamazoo, north to Saginaw, south essentially to the Ohio border, and then east to Macomb County. Beyond, we actually also technically include the Windsor area. So we are the only international heritage area, but as we completed our application, the National Park Service recognized the significant automotive heritage of southern Ontario and Canada region, and the connection between the two and the auto heritage here. So we happily work with our friends in Canada. So that is the visualization. So generally speaking, you want to come up with what area your heritage area, your facility fits into, and certainly reach out to me if you have a question on that, because you just want to kind of come up with those buckets and understand where you are coming from. So if you're in the radius of Flint, whether you're in Burton or Davidson or any of those surrounding Grand Blanc or any of those surrounding areas, you're sort of in that Flint area. So that's how we sort of characterize it. I'll pause here. I do see a question from David Fisher, which seems to make a lot of sense to answer now, which is how does one become a member of Motor Cities National Heritage Area? So in the chat, I'm going to include the link to the online membership. It is our current 2018 membership application. So it would be ideal to simply click there and follow those steps. There's individual members and there's organizational members. So you want to click through and take a look at the organizational membership if you are thinking about applying for a grant. You'll get an idea. The memberships are scaled based on the honor system, but it's based on your organization's operating budget and staff and capacity. So we trust you to be honest with that, but we always want to have people represent at the appropriate membership level if they're going to be involved. So that is how you become a member. Thanks, David, for that question. So then we move on to some of the authorization piece of the application. Here's again a common question. The authorizing official is the person who is designated with the authority to sign grant agreements. In some organizations, that person is completely different than, say, the development officer who's writing the grant, because the two wouldn't have the ability. But we're talking about the person who, if you were awarded a grant, this is the person that we send the grant agreement to that can sign on behalf of the organization, the executive director, the president of the board, et cetera. If those people are one and the same, a lot of times small organizations, they are one-stop shop and you're able to do those sorts of things. But certainly we want to make sure we have a clarification of who the authorizer is versus the next question, which is who the project contact is. So this will be the person who, once that agreement is signed and we're actually moving forward in the project, that person and myself would become real close friends. This is the person we'll be in regular communication with to keep updated on, hey, how are things going? Or we need to update or think about how the grant is moving along and go back and forth on that. So the main point of contact for the project should be the project contact there. Makes sense. And then sort of a third delineation is the fiscal contact. Again, some organizations will have an accountant or a chief financial officer or someone who provides that sort of information, but that we need someone who has access about specific financials, can provide invoices, timesheets, and that sort of thing Again, it may be a different person, it may be a one-stop shop, but we need to identify each one of those three individuals: authorizing official, uh, project contact, and then the fiscal contact for questions about financial matters. Then we get into, speaking of financial matters, the budget. So when you are preparing your application, you will need to, of course, attach a budget, but this is a snapshot of your budget. So what we want to know is the total project cost for the project that you are proposing to us. So one of the questions that comes up, I'll answer now, is sometimes a person is proposing a part of a larger project. So the question is, well, do you want the entirety of the project? Does it cost us $1 million to replace our roof? Or do you want the project budget of the section of roof we are planning to replace in this go around? In this case, we want the project budget of the section that you're going to replace for the window of time that you're describing. So if the roof replacement is a 4-year process and it's going to cost $1 million, but this year it's going to be $250,000 of it, then the total project cost for this year that you're submitting is $250,000. So that's what you would be putting in that top box. Total eligible project cost. We'll get into eligible versus ineligible, but eligible project costs are those that don't fall into this category of ineligible. So anything that we know meets the eligibility criteria that I'm going to describe in a moment. So in some cases, if you're go back to our roof example, in some cases, if you're $250,000 for a roof this year, but $20,000 of it is from a federal grant, you'll have to subtract that out of our request. Or if $20,000 of it is time fundraising for the roof, which is an ineligible expense, you have to take that out. So it is what is eligible under our guidelines versus what the total costs are. Then the Motor Cities share. This is where just kind of a simple math comes in that we know that our match is 20%. So we are looking for the 20% calculation there to show that you have done that, the eligible project cost, and then Motor Cities 20%, which means that the applicant share is the other portion of it that will be covered. So this is just a snapshot again of the project and a little test on the math to make sure that everybody's clear on that. So again, common question of what is the difference between total project cost and total eligible cost. Some projects will involve funds or activities which are not eligible and should be identified and separated. And here we go into some examples of eligible costs. These are deemed as costs necessary to the completion of the grant as outlined in your budget. So this could be contractors, consultants, materials, services, staff hours dedicated to the project. And with documentation, we always want to make that clear that you need to, if you're going to include your staff hours for internal work that you are paying off a regular paycheck and not a contractor, then you must have a way that you are documenting those staff hours, whether it's a timesheet or some sort of automated punch in and out system or time allocation that you can share with us. But we need to be clear that it's not for all of the general activities of that staff member, but it is specific to the work on the grant project. Many places have, a similar system where they would have a way that their payroll system separates the person by project, and that way you don't get any confusion on what thing they're working on. Many of you report to different funders and need to be able to provide that data anyway, so it may be pretty easy, but for others, we always want to give them the heads up that you need to be able to track that. Similar concept with the volunteer hours, and that many people, many organizations are really powered by those volunteers. So the question is whether or not you are tracking them independently. So that means you need to have some sort of sign-in, sign-out system, some sort of initialing or other way that you are providing proof that these volunteers were there at the time frame that you are describing. That's the other key element, is that you are positioning yourself where you're using volunteers for the grant, so it needs to be within the window of time that the grant is occurring, and thus you will need to make sure you're documenting those volunteer hours and date it so that we know when they occurred. Volunteer mileage is acceptable as well, but they need to have support materials including dates, start and end destination, and reasons for the trip. We understand that if you're working on, especially some of our physical preservation and restoration projects, you may make 1 million trips to Home Depot. You are able to catalog those trips back and forth. You are able to receive the credit for volunteer mileage based on the federal reimbursement rate. So you are able to utilize those, absolutely. Same thing with volunteer hours. There's a pretty sort of generous volunteer rate, around $24 an hour or so, that's just for general volunteerism, which is great. So you can utilize that provided that you are documenting that those hours. You can utilize that volunteer match. And then in-kind value with proper documentation. This is those who made items that you may not have to purchase, that because a partner is donating to you, you're repairing windows, but someone donates the glass, or the glass has value, and so you create a value for that, either from the vendor who provides that information to you, or some other comparable way that you are showing the market value for those donated items, or for service, same thing. If you have an accountant, a lawyer who is typically charged a certain fee for that sort of work, then the work that they do can be submitted as in-kind donated service, provided again it comes from their letterhead or some other way to document the value of the time that they provided here. Common question we get into is, having an engineer, having a lawyer who volunteers to come to your place and paint your barn. Well, then you're not able to submit the hourly rate of an engineer or a lawyer at that point, because they're not doing the work that they would normally be paid for. They're actually painting the barn. You are able to, if you want to qualify them, say for the going rate of a painter, then that may be one thing. But typically, most people elect to go with just the volunteer hour, sort of the standard acceptable rate. So let's get into some examples of ineligible costs. These are costs that are not deemed necessary for the goal of the project or its completion. So this includes incidental costs not directly associated with the project. So again, if you are operating your organization and you want to include your phone bill, your heating and lighting, things like that, those are things that are not going to be eligible to be reimbursed, simply because we can't delineate how directly they are related to the completion of the project. We cannot, because we are federally funded, we cannot match or include funds that are from another federal funding source. So many, again, receive grants and other funding. So we have to be clear and be sure that when we are accepting funds for our grant, that we are not accepting cash that you have received from another federal funding source. Activities which are perceived as fundraising, again, because of our nonprofit status and because of our federal funding, we cannot contribute grant funds to general fundraising. So if you have a project in incubation, we want to open a new exhibit next year, we cannot submit expenses for the director's time to go and fundraise for that exhibit, or for the soiree fundraising dinner that you have in order to get the money up. We simply have to utilize the cost for the project itself, not the fundraising and build up to it. Activities associated with or lobbying or political positioning. So again, federally funded, as well as being a 501c3 nonprofit, we cannot fund and accept lobbying activities. So you cannot include any work that includes direct solicitation or work with an elected official or someone to be elected for political positioning. So please exclude those. Food and beverage costs. There is a bit of a gray area with this, but we will say, generally speaking, if you have your volunteers working at a site and you say, hey, we had to break and everyone went for lunch, unfortunately, no, we cannot reimburse the lunch costs, the dinner costs of different projects, just because they're incidental. We have been asked that question if we are funding a awards dinner or a banquet or something that recognizes, say, student achievement in auto history. Would the banquet and the cost of the meal be applicable towards the grant? It certainly depends on how necessary and how ingrained the meal portion is with your project. If you have a banquet that's been going on for 30 years and that is, sort of tradition of what goes into your project and submitted with your budget, the worst that can happen is the grant committee reviews it and decides to eliminate that portion of it. But if you are creating an activity and figure, hey, we might as well throw in the lunch, then no, we would have to exclude the food and beverage costs, simply because it's a cost that can get out of hand and a cost that the National Park Service and the federal government don't deem necessary for the completion of the project. And then general promotion of events, conferences, etc. So many times people are submitting something that amounts to an ad. They're saying, well, we'd like to get a grant to talk about our upcoming car show or upcoming exhibit or event. Promotion of the activity is fine, but general promotion of, say, an event or a conference is not acceptable. We need to be looking at the educational element of it that you are promoting. So the actual activity, not the event itself, should be the focus of your application. So we get this with maybe some of our car cruises, our car shows, where they say, well, we got the big show coming up here. but we want to focus on what educational element, what seminar, what article, what booklet are you producing as part of that event, and that's the part we want to look at for funding for a grant. And then utilities and maintenance costs, which cannot be easily identified. So, in our preservation, restoration activities, you may be working on a facility and it may require electrical maintenance or upgrading. It may require plumbing work. So, we need to make sure that those things are isolated and identified, but we can't just say, here's the water bill because we had to do a lot of plumbing work at this site during the project. It needs to be identified as to why this particular plumbing work or this particular water bill would be germane to the application that you're submitting, because that's critical to us justifying it with our federal funding. I'll pause again here. Any questions we do have, you have the opportunity to do a hand raising. And I hope I'm not missing any of those. So if you want to raise your hand for a question, I can unmute you. That'd be fine. Or again, you could share it in the chat. There's also a questions mechanism if you want to hit it that way. I did see Charles Pike. Your question is, will you be able to share your presentation? Yes, the slides will ultimately be available at motorcities.org/grants. I'm also hoping to have an actual downloaded version of this audio, this entire presentation there. So if someone who has not been able to join us can simply play it and hear that explanation along with the visuals here. So yes, the slides will be available, and hopefully the entire webinar will have a place there as well. Okay. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of your project. This, again, as we're continuing on with the application, your project summary, these will be things that are very specific to what you are submitting. So a lot of that previous stuff was obviously germane to your project, but this is where you really get a chance to express the details of your project and really beef up the application with all the great stuff you're going to do. So this will vary for each project, but generally speaking, these are the nuts and bolts of it. You'll have a summary paragraph. This is a relatively short sort of abstract, if you will, descriptive piece of generally what your project is going to do. The second section is the longer drawn out portion. So this is where you really want to go into detail about your entire project. And there's no upper word limit, but there are some details in there about what needs to happen. Outline concisely the projects and tasks needed to complete the project. For each major activity and task, give a general timeline for completion if you need to break it up that way, and then identify the Motor Cities involvement. So how will the heritage area be recognized? How will it be involved? How will you engage with us during the process, if at all, if that's necessary? And we are certainly open to that. But at the end, how will the heritage area and the Park Services contribution be recognized at the end of the project? So that's all part of your project description, but again, it'll vary. That is essentially your wide open narrative that tells the story of your project. And then your performance measures. These are things that you're going to identify as how you're going to track, how you're going to create the tangible or track the tangible measurable output. So things that are going to come out of your project at the very end. When you get done, we will produce 5,000 brochures for student groups. We will host this many group tours. We will have restored this many square foot of roof in our historic building. So you need to identify those performance measures as immediate outputs. And then outcomes are the longer term effects to the organization or to the audience, depending on your project. But you might want to identify how this work is going to have this long-term effect. Now that we've replaced our roof, our building will be more secure, more people will be able to visit more safely, our artifacts, our exhibits will be protected, things like that. So you want to be identifying both the outputs of immediate at the end of the project and then the long-term outcomes that you think are going to be influential, and you will detail how you gather and assess that information for your project. So every project will differ. It depends on what you're creating, but if you're creating an exhibit and you say that the measurement is going to be how many people visit that exhibit during the window of time it's up, then certainly you want to have some attendance numbers to report back once you get to the end of the project to let us know that we did indeed attract 10,000 visitors during the year that the exhibit was in place. So just something to think about. This is where I would encourage questions as you're preparing it, and then communication once you're selected as a grant recipient, communication as you go along to make sure we're tracking this correctly, make sure you're able to provide all that information. some tips as you go through the project, through the process of filling out the application. There is an option. You can save your progress at any point throughout the process. There's a button on the actual online form that says save progress and resume later. This feature will not retain uploaded attachments, though. We've learned and have to let people know. It's noted right on there that there's an option to include attachments, so support, they'll say letters of support or other details that you might want to share. You can only do that as the final step before you submit. So if you upload an attachment and then you press save progress, those attachments will not be saved in that spot in time. You'd have to come back and upload them again. So just keep that in mind. Just in case you miss that. Sometimes we'll have a person who will think they've saved that attachment, and then when they submit it, it's not there. So then they have to find a way to, share those attachments again. So we want to just make sure you're clear on that. Please, 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 please maintain a backup version, a backup document of your work, just in case there is any issue. Some people sit down and they pour their hearts into their narrative and all the things they're going to do with their project, and then for whatever reason, the lightning strikes, the power goes out, the dog ate the cord, something happens where they have lost their work as they're going along, and you don't want to have that. So please maintain a backup document, and really we would encourage that you start your narrative, especially things like that, as a Word document or some other word processing software, so that you have it in a different location and then simply copy it and paste it into the online application when you're ready. So that way you don't lose anything as you go along, and you can go back to it, and if something happens, you just grab that version and drop it back in there again. As a note, when you do submit your application, you do receive a full version of what you submitted. So everything from the project description, the name, the contact information, all the way up through all the attachments that you provide will all be emailed back to the listed project contact when you're done. So you will get a copy of that. If anything else comes up, I also have a copy of it, of course, once it's submitted too. So your work's not lost, but certainly we would encourage that you keep a backup copy there. And as you upload documents, they can be uploaded as Word documents, Excel documents, PDFs. That'd be the ideal way to upload things. There is an upper limit to the size of the file that you can upload, so you want to keep an eye on that. If the system rejects, I believe it's 10 megabytes. So if the system rejects your file based on size, you have to find a way to resize it and resave it to that proper size. Let's talk a little bit more about the performance measures. So each project will need to identify and implement its measurement of the project. How will you report on how your project was successful in, let's say, preserving an artifact or a site, or attracting visitors, or educating, or distributing materials, or whatever it is that you are, really leaning towards saying that this is the goal and what the project is going to accomplish. You also have to describe how you're going to measure that. So if it is to increase visitorship, you're going to say, well, between this period and this period, visitorship increased, and this is how we know. We collected information. We clicked the turnstile. We sold this many tickets. Whatever it is that you're going to utilize, then please. Please, take a look at that and include that as part of it. The budget should show all the elements of the projects that will lead to its completion. So you need to have information about contractors you're going to work with. So you may have a quote, or you may have an actual, person on site or already working on the project that you kind of have a pretty reliable quote or pretty reliable number on. But you want to have all that information as part of your budget: contractors, consultants, materials, services, staff hours if they're going to be included. As I've said before, you need to have the proper documentation to be able to share with us those staff hours, volunteer hours, in-kind value, et cetera. These could all be part of your budget, need to all be part of your budget as you describe the overall costs of the project. And of course, it should add up to that number that you put in when you talk about eligible costs. This is, again, the actual version of the online form, which includes the budget. There will be a point of applicant assurance that explains how you will recognize Motor Cities and identify it in print materials or presentations or whatever the appropriate way that you would recognize a funder for a project. Every project doesn't have the opportunity to put up a large plaque or have a huge grand opening. It all depends on what the project is. But however you would find appropriate, you need to detail that there. So whether it is a plaque on the wall that says a portion of this building was restored by the Motor Cities National Heritage Area, whether it is a recognition at your annual meeting or in your newsletter or print publication or in your brochure, we need to make sure we identify that. This is also the section and that final step that I was describing where this is where you would upload your documents, your any support materials. So the budget summary is necessary. So you'll need to have a separate document or Excel spreadsheet or PDF that details the budget with all those line items I described, so all the elements that go into it. You need to provide proof of your nonprofit status. This is typically a determination letter or something from the IRS that shows your nonprofit status that will have your nonprofit ID number on there. So we would have that as backup to the number that you entered at the beginning of the application. You have a list of your current board members. For most nonprofits, you're going to have that current list, and these are the people who obviously are ultimately accountable to your organization's leadership. So we want to have that list of board members. And then any letters of support. This is optional, but if you have additional letters of support, which are always great, that add a lot of fabric to the story of your project, then you want to include those. What we say is to upload a single file. So if you have 5 letters of support, if you want to share blueprints or renderings of your project or something like that, then we need to combine that all into one file. We won't be able to upload 5 different individual files. What we need to do is somehow you need to scan those into one file so that you can upload it as one. So, but that is an option there if you want to add additional materials for support, which always helps to paint the picture, more clearly when people are reviewing it. And let's talk about reimbursement. So in our ideal scenario, you have been selected as a grant recipient for the Heritage Area for this year, and you can start that process right away. Your reimbursement or your funding would be eligible all the way back to the beginning of the application. So in your case, we're submitting an application as of February 28th. So though it will be a little bit of time for gathering and review and announcement of awards, when you get your awards, you will be eligible to go back to February 28th. For those who have received grants in the past or have received one already, we typically start with the beginning of our fiscal year, as I described. That's the first time you would be eligible. So for those who submitted grants back in October, their grants would be eligible all the way back to October 1st of 2017. But just to be specific, in your case, we would be talking about a grant that would be eligible starting February 28th, since that is the date the application would be due, and we go backwards from there. So you can submit as often as once per month. So some people are, as they go through their project, it's easier for them to gather their receipts or reconcile with their accountant or just internally, and they like to submit, pretty regularly just to keep everything organized and keep a good cash flow going. So you're certainly able to do that. We encourage that. It creates a lot less work on the tail end for those who want to submit at the very end. So please feel free to do it that way. However, they are subject to review by Motor Cities and approval of the National Park Service. That's one reason why we encourage the regular submission, because there could be hangups in the review process and the verification process. So if you have something in the hopper, then at least you are moving forward versus, again, stacking it all up and waiting until the very end to get through. And I'll give you a real life example of one. This is what the actual reimbursement form looks like. It is a spreadsheet, but I think just the way it would transfer it over here, you may not see those grid lines in your presentation, but it is a spreadsheet. So that's how we want to fill it out. That's how you would return it back to me, as a spreadsheet for review. So that way any additional figures can be manipulated and updated without much challenge. So the grant, it comes as a template. You would typically see you're submitting essentially an invoice from your organization. So your Friends of Local History, including your address and city, state, and zip. You're submitting it to Motor Cities National Heritage Area for your project, climate control project, and then we go down from there. So the date that you're submitting it would, in this case, for this example, was June 1st, and it's covering a period from that previous October up until June 1st. And then you see how right here you've got everything itemized So what it is. So we want invoices and receipts with the dates. So the invoice from Autumn Air Mechanical, which was dated November 11, 2016, in the amount of $14,000 for what? This part is up to you as far as how much detail you need to add here for what it's for. But in some cases, if you have a very technical invoice or a schedule of payment to a contractor that's not very apparent to somebody reading it, then you might want to detail out what this particular element is for. And I think they did a good job with this, with the 90%, and then you see the next payment representing the final 10% of their project. And then you go on from there, other contractors, other payments that are made out. Same thing with the detailing of what it was for and how they got down to it. And even their trip to Menards, as you see at the bottom of the page, on the fourth. So provided you have a receipt, what it is that you're purchasing, making sure that it's germane to the project, and that's certainly an acceptable way to do it. You want to hold on to those. Continuing on, this is actually just the continuation of that same page. It's broken up into two different sections. So you see the Menards receipt there, but I was going to show you that the spreadsheet tallies up your total expenses, and then the reimbursement requested. So again, this is the 20%. So the spreadsheet would do the work there and automatically calculate what is owed to you based on that. The grant summary shows you the original grant award. So this project was originally awarded $7,560. They have already, in a previous request, received $1,000 some dollars. Again, you can request relatively regularly and often, so that's nothing unusual. So you would have already, we'd have a running calculation of what you've already been reimbursed. The current request is the $5,536.40, which you see from the calculation above, and then the spreadsheet gives you a calculation of what even remains now on your grant for a future drawdown. So you have that available to you, and everybody sort of signs off on that in black and white. So internally, MotorCities reviews it and then approves it, and that's when it's ready for funding. So that's pretty clear, but that is what we would expect is the financial report for whatever window of time that you're submitting for. And then, of course, with that financial report as an Excel spreadsheet, you would also send back one PDF, which it contains all of the scans of these invoices or these documents that you're using to substantiate your costs. So if you have an invoice, canceled check some people use, receipts from your local visits. So if you had to go to Menards or Lowe's, Home Depot, etc., you would need to have that receipt with the date and the amounts very clear so we could see it. So whatever it is that backs up your expense. I spent a lot of time earlier on talking about the timesheets, talking about volunteer hours and timesheets. You need to have that. If that is what you're submitting as part of your expense, then that's what you need to send along with your timesheet. So that's what you would include there with your reimbursement request. And then a question way down the line would be grant closeout. I'm again going to reference the motorcities.org/grants. Take a look at that because there is the actual live link to these two pieces that I'm describing here. So along with the financial report, all recipients would have to submit a performance measures report. This is where you are reporting on the things that you described, things that you said you were going to do in your project. You need to now explain how you did them. So this is your moment. We would explain them there. So you want to do that, and then also the partner feedback survey, which is a sort of qualitative survey about your relationship with MotorCities as a funder and how it, did or didn't help you in leveraging and supporting your projects and things like that. But these are the two reports along with the financial report that are due in order to close out your project, or as you see. As you go along, you'll see that you need to turn it in at the 60 days after the end of the project or 60 days after the end of the fiscal year, whichever one comes first. So the details are in that page, and certainly ask any questions, but we want to let people know right up front what they should be gunning for so they're available online right now. And folks, that is the end of the presentation portion of it. We're going to get into the questions, but that is the end of the presentation portion. I want to leave that screen there for a minute so you guys can see my contact information. If you ever need to reach out specifically on your project or on ideas as you're developing it, you can contact me there. You can email me there. Information is also on the motorcities.org/grants page, so that is definitely there for you. Feel free to reach out at any time. And I'm going to take a look at the questions. And we can answer that. And if you have any, feel free to submit them there in the chat or in the questions page. I'll also put this reminder up about the annual meeting at GM Factory 1 on April 18th. You can come and take a look at what other projects that have gone on in the past year, both grant projects and other Motor Cities related projects that might help you out and get some ideas of what's going on there. Chris, I see Chris Bunch. You've left a great inquiry here about a specific project. So I'll have to be in touch with you about the project itself, and I'll reach out to you separately so that way I can give you an answer to the eligibility of the project you're describing, and how it would work out. But so we'll be in touch shortly after. I'll put this up again about the dates of things that are coming up. So the grant cycle ends February 28th, and the awards will be announced by April 1st. It most likely will be sooner, but we want to give ourselves at least that period of time to make sure that we have time to review the grants and make any adjustments or any follow-ups to take care of that. So folks, if there are any questions, if you need to ask an audio question, let me know. Or if there are any questions you want to pop into the chat, let me know. Make sure we're not leaving anybody out. Put our contact information back up. There's that. Contact information. Thanks, Chris. Got your contact. Thanks a lot. Well, I'll definitely be in touch. We'll follow up on how those specific pieces go together. So thank you for that. Whether or not your project would be eligible, and we'll go over the details of that one. Any other questions? Anything that you think we may have not really touched on? Any questions that you have lingering? I always encourage folks, hey, ask the question, because there may be somebody else, even in this forum, that may want to have that same question answered or maybe thinking about it separately. All my contact information is there. These are the dates coming up soon. So one last chance. I think I see someone wanting to ask a question here, Richard. Let me get to you. All right. Okay, I'll start with Kathy. I'm sorry. I'm going to unmute you, and you should be able to speak to the group now. Kathy? Kathy? Okay. Okay. So maybe we're not able to get to that one. Okay, let me make sure. All right, let's take one last look at the questions and make sure we're not missing anyone. Okay, here's a question. So, do you have any projects or heritage properties you would like to see taken up for repairs? So, it sounds like there's an opportunity being offered. Do we have any specific projects you would like to see taken up for repair? There are certainly, David Fisher, certainly a lot of projects that we would probably assign. If there were a group that were willing to work on some things, we could assign projects to them. So absolutely, there are projects that we would love to see, but we'd have to get a little more specific about which ones you think are the ones that fit the mold. But there's always great projects that if you're a willing worker that's sort of looking to be assigned to one, we can certainly help you out with that. Richard Russell says only one grant per fiscal year, please advise. So no, you can submit grants for multiple projects within the same year, and they will be considered. In some cases, they have been awarded. There were projects over the last few years that we have awarded multiple projects to the same organization within 1 year because they were distinct enough that they could stand on their own. So certainly, great question, but you can award multiple projects within the same year. Correct. We have, let's see, another question. Okay. I think we've covered quite a bit here. If I'm not getting your question, is anybody any other questions? Okay, well, then if there are no other questions, I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to make sure that, again, you guys have all of my contact information. If you want to follow up with anything individually, we'll certainly be happy to answer those. I'll go back to contact info, and if not, then we're gonna go ahead and wrap up the session. I really appreciate everyone joining us here today. And again, any questions that you want to follow up on, feel free to reach out. And if not, then we look forward to your grant project coming in. I'm sorry. Do have a question. So, can a grant be requested if project with the previous grant did not meet project deadline? Certainly, that would not put a new applicant in a very strong position, because the grant committee, has a memory that spans across multiple years. They review projects and take a look at things like that. So unfortunately, that would create a pretty tough spot if you had a project that did not meet the previous guidelines, did not meet the previous deadline. So you would want to have a real strong case for how this project and this go around will somehow meet the deadline where the other one did not. So yeah, unfortunately, that's really something you'd have to make a strong case about. Okay. All right, everyone. Contact information is there. Really appreciate you joining it, and we're looking forward to um, seeing your grant applications come in. Again, the deadline is February 28th. Feel free to reach out and contact me with any questions as you build it up. And we would also love to see you April 18th at the Motor Cities annual meeting in Flint. Thanks a lot, folks. We will talk to you soon.